dear friend, Mr. Mohammed Bakr. Also, I feel humbled by the fact that I'm addressing a learned scholarly audience coming after such an illustrious, first plenary speaker. So God help me. All right. What I like about the title of this event were dynamics. And I'll be trying to argue that dynamics is really the exact pre-modifier for resistance and discontent, because with the evolution of different media and platforms and modalities, indeed, this question of dynamic is very important. Secondly, I wish to argue that determining the nature of the social movements is open for negotiation, hence the term negotiation in my title. And third, the manifestations of discontent involve various fields and disciplines, and I invite you here to a critical review of literature in 5 different areas associated with discontent and resistance. First, I'll talk about rhetoric and multimodal analysis, and then I'll move on to political discourse analysis with special focus on secularism versus religion. And then I'll move on to historiography, and I'll talk about history from above versus history from below. At the later stage, I'll talk about literary criticism, and I'll try to revisit the posts in post-structuralism, postmodernism, post-colonialism, and I'll talk especially about the ethical turn. And I'll end up my lecture with critical pedagogy, talk about language policy, curriculum design, global education. So different angles. First of all, the first angle is the rhetorical angle, and I'll talk about rhetorics of social resistance. The first point is the emergence of the social movement rhetoric, SMR. Out 2011, credits Griffin with the inception of the study of social movement rhetoric, which aimed at broadening the scope of inquiry beyond the narrow confines of the individual orator to include the social or historical movement. Critics are encouraged to attend to the pattern of public discussion, the configuration of discourse, the physiognomy of persuasion peculiar to the movement. Though exceedingly diverse, the SMR tradition generally is concerned with how rhetorics of protest and discourses of dissension foster and facilitate social change. And then I'll talk about movements in the plural, not the social movement, but movements. Ott contends that although in the early years social movement criticism tended to stress the radical, the revolutionary, and the extreme, in ensuing decades, scholars observed that the rhetorical modes and means of effecting social change vary greatly by cultural and historical context. This author insists that symbolic actions that promote and bring about social change need not be drastic and confrontational, nor do they need to be especially unified, organized, or even intentional. Consequently, Ott warns against treating the discourses of dissension on a given social issue as a movement, as that would dangerously risk homogenizing a diverse set of voices, viewpoints, and volitions under a single label, motive, and purpose. The alternative rhetorics of social resistance, RSR. Ott proposes the notion of rhetorics of social resistance, in the plural, to account for the expanding range of practices that once fell comfortably under the umbrella of social movement rhetoric. This author acknowledges the difficulty to define the concept of resistance, as it is frequently invoked by critics without careful explication or reflection. Ott, therefore, defines resistance as any discourse, performance, or aesthetic practice which, through its symbolic and or material enactment, transgresses, subverts, disrupts, and or rebels against the social codes, customs, and or conventions that, through their everyday operation, create, sustain, and naturalize the prevailing relations of power in a particular time and place. Whilst acknowledging the diversity of the possible modes of resistance, Ott calls for a mapping of those possibilities along the intersecting axes of agent, individual, collective, and action, coordinated or disruptive. Now I move to Riley's perspective on political jokes. Ott cites Riley, who was discussing the functions of political jokes in an East German historical context, to the effect that political jokes are a prevalent form of bush casting, constituting an important form of resistance. But they succinctly captured anti-regime sentiments, undermined the state's authority, fostered a sense of belonging and identification, promoted democratic feelings, and functioned therapeutically to help people cope with the and maintain psychological distance from the regime. In so doing, political jokes specifically and bushcasting in general set the stage for more open and outward resistive activities. The fifth sub-angle is the visuality of cultural genres. Ott cites Harold to the effect that resistance lies in the largely visual politics of cultural genres, a diverse international alliance of activists responding to the proliferation of commercialization in civic life. Harold's approach, based on the premise that corporate branding dominates public life and culture in late modernity, seeks to chart the possibilities available for political action in this context. For that purpose, her study investigates the dialectic between markets and publics, between their space and our space. Sixth sub-angle is the corporeality of transgression. Ott cites Faust to determine how transgressing subjects, anarchists in this case, enact spontaneous forms of embodied resistance in response to late capitalism and corporate globalization. Ott notes how Faust effectively shifts the focus from collective, calculated and mediated strategies of resistance to more individual, improvised and immediate performances of resistance. Faust proffers the concept of transgressive resistance, which entails open-ended tactics of resistance and stresses agency as the drive force for social change rather than change agents. The seventh sub-component is the performativity of camp culture. Ott assigns pride of place to performance, being the vehicle through which the other aspects of camp are enacted. Ott concludes that the rhetorical study of camp is fundamentally the study of performativity, and to the extent that female camp involved the play of gender, the rhetorical study of female camp is fundamentally the study of gender performativity. The eighth sub-angle is mediation as resistance. Ott associates publicity with the strategic rhetorical efforts of a person or group to frame the public's perception of a subject. This author programs the mediated role of resistive rhetorics in promoting social change. The discourse and actions of individuals or groups pass through the filter of the media, both mainstream and alternative, where they are distorted, altered, and transformed by attendant discourses and commentary. The material effects of transgressive rhetorics are affected by the ways in which they are managed, mitigated, and manipulated. Now, to synthesize this first section, reflections on resistance and social change. First of all, there is a focus on consequentiality. For Ott, rhetoric is defined by its capacity to effect change in the attitudes, values, and beliefs of individuals and the rules, rituals, and norms of collectives. He takes evaluating rhetoric's consequentiality to be an important but challenging enterprise, as it raises questions and concerns about what counts as suitable evidence of rhetoric's influence and effects. Second, the need for ethnographic data collection methods. Art recommends that rhetorical studies benefit from an increased engagement with interviewing and ethnographic methods, especially in instances where critics are attempting to understand how the daily lives of ordinary people have been altered by resistive discourses. The next point is the historiographic focus on primary sources. Art highlights the importance of primary documents. In some cases, social change is a matter of historical record, and the task of the critic becomes one of conducting intensive archival research to recover the disparate discourses that contributed to changes in social practices and policies. A greater focus on the changing rhetorical modalities. For art, scholars of dissension need to explore the full range of rhetorical modalities available to those who would challenge or subvert prevailing social codes and structures. This requires attention to the mode of expression, visual, oral, tactile, the medium or context of transmission, immediate, mediated, virtual, and the means or mechanism of enactment, symbolicity, embodied performance, built or constructed environment. However, this author insists, as the technologies of communication continue to converge and change, so too will the modes by which resistance is carried out. So critics need to be vigilant in recognizing and remapping rhetoric's ever-evolving modalities. Mediated and immediate transgressive acts engage and involve audiences differently. The importance of affect. Art argues that resistive social rhetorics, which often foreground visceral appeals, are uniquely suited for exploring the emotive dimensions of politics and social change. How, for instance, do televisional images of the non-violent actions of protesters or the violent actions of single-issue extremists move viewers at the bodily level? Spatial situatedness. Art contends that rhetoric is a situated activity, one that is profoundly shaped by the time and place of its enactment. Serious engagements with resistive rhetorics need carefully to consider not only the cultural moment, but also the cultural emplacement of symbolic action. But critics need to investigate the role of spatiality in rhetorics of social resistance as well. How, for instance, do protesters with signs standing on the sidewalk differ from protesters with signs marching down the street? How is an act of resistance altered when it moves from the open public space of the street to the semi-public space of the church or business to the interior, private space of a home to the networked virtual space of Facebook? Now I move to the second angle, which is political dissidence. I'll talk about secularism versus religious revitalization. According to Vaggioni, 2005, secularism provided for decades a powerful paradigm that strongly influenced the social sciences. This author contends that mixing analytical and normative elements and collapsing different dimensions, secularism served as a theoretical and political tool for regulating religion in democratic societies. Moreover, Vaggioni credits secularization theory with offering a historical account of modernity as a process of differentiation that ended up with religion relegated to the margins. Second concept advocated by Vaggioni is the concept of reactive politicization. Vaggioni defines reactive mutations as political in the sense that they are a legitimized part of the democratic game. For him, the term politicization aims to capture what is usually overlooked by approaches emphasizing secularization, namely the inclusion of religious groups defending the family as legitimate public actors. Vaggioni highlights two principal changes that are part of the reactive politicization, namely an increased NGOization of religion, whereby the religious defense of the natural family is not undertaken by churches or temples, and their representatives, but also by an increasing number of civil society organizations defending religious doctrines. I think this is quite relevant in Tunisia. Such organizations represent an important phase of religious revitalization. Besides, patriarchal religious groups are articulating their worldview less through religious discourse than through secular discourses. Instead of centering on the notions of morality and God, they are turning to scientific data and legal discourses in a sort of strategic secularism. The NGOization and strategic secularism are ways in which religion continues to be a crucial public dimension. The third angle is historiography and the inclusion of microhistory or history from below. Klovenberg, 2012, celebrates the attention paid by many intellectual historians to texts of a different kind from grand narratives, diaries, court records, and the minutes of the meetings of labor unions and organizations devoted to social protest. Accordingly, intellectual history, according to Klovenberg, is extending into domains often associated with social or cultural history, such as everyday life, the rituals and festivals that punctuate it. Scholars are exploring phenomena as diverse as the history of corporations and the history of jazz, along the way uncovering the ideas that inspired the creators, the critics, and those who became part of the nation that proved so hospitable to both American forms of improvisation. The fourth angle is the literary input, and I talk about literary criticism as discipline. I'm talking in the presence of many literary gurus around. What defines the postmodern, according to Mansfield 2000, is not the principle of meaning, but an uncertainty or interruption, at most a feeling. The dominant postmodern feeling is one of panic and fear. For Glades, 2012, modernism represented the world as fragmented and incoherent, as an irrational collection of random events, and lamented the loss of meaning and structure in the modern world. Postmodernism sees the same incoherence, but celebrates the ridiculousness of trying to make meaning and order out of the irrational and random. By the mid-1960s and into the 1970s, critics like Leslie Fiedler, Susan Sontag, and Ihab Hassan were outwardly celebrating just such a rupture or epistemic upheaval, revealing the postmodern aversion or outward resistance to final meanings, authorial intentions, and thus interpretation. Moreover, Baudrillard explores what he perceives to be a depthless world of unreflecting images, where signs no longer correspond to or mask their real-life reference, that replaced it in a world of autonomous floating signifiers. Postmodernity is depicted in terms of the disappearance of meaning, of inertia, exhaustion, and endings, whether of history or subjectivity. In his turn, Lyotard launched a vehement critique of the totalizing claims of reason as being without moral or philosophical ground, stripping, legitimating meta-narratives or ground concrete of any credibility. Many critics have shown the problematic nature of postmodernism. For instance, Carter, 2006, has shown that postmodernism can be seen as a positive, liberating force, destabilizing preconceived notions of language and its relation to the world, and undermining all meta-languages about history and society. This is on one hand. On the other hand, Carter contends it's also seen as undermining its own presuppositions and warding off all coherent interpretations. For many, it's apolitical and ironically non-committal. Thus, postmodernism is dangerously nihilistic, as it undermines the notion of objective knowledge and leads to the demise of all truth and value, to a moral vacuum.
In her most recently published novel,
The fifth angle is the empowerment and resistance from a seen from a curricular perspective. First, I'll talk about resistance, agency, and transformation. A nice citation from Giroux, 2002. He says, if progressives are to revitalize the language of civic education as part of a broader discourse of political agency and critical citizenship in a global world, they will have to consider grounding such a call in the defense of militant utopian thinking, in which any vital notion of the political takes up the primacy of pedagogy as part of a broader attempt to revitalize the conditions for individual and social agency, while simultaneously addressing the most basic problem facing the prospect of social justice.
The verb to exist means.
Second,
For example,
dissidence
we might ask ourselves whether it
research has shown that there is no such thing as a neutral educational process.
to inanimate objects.
Education either functions as an
Do animals exist
facilitate the integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity to it, or it becomes the practice of freedom. This means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. Every relationship of hegemony, says Gramsci, is necessarily an educational relationship.
Existence in its fullest sense to the
In
human
a synthesis
alone.
on thwarting agency in the EFL
For
curriculum,
animals and chairs
by
and
claims
tables
of educational
individually
empowerment
exist
of
in the
resistance,
sense that
and
they
what
have
Benelli,
reality
2017,
or actual
built
being.
his
They
arguments
do
on two
not
major
stand
theoretical
out or
principles.
stand forth.
First,
from
because
this
curriculum represents the introduction
They are,
of
on
a
the
particular
contrary,
form of life, it
And
serves
that
in part
integral
to prepare
is highly
students for dominant
integrated part of the
or
reality
subordinate
that shares
positions
with the
in the
world around
existing
them.
society.
Happily
Second,
for them, perhaps.
Gramsci asserts that
Not
the process of
not
subordinating
separated
subordinate is
outside
a process that
or
operates mainly
fronted
through
in
coercion,
everywhere.
marginalization,
Whereas we, the
or
human animal,
and
are
cooptation,
separated from both,
self-marginalization
reality of the
on the part of the dominant.
essentially.
And that will ultimately lead to the subordinate
our very
will
nature.
to exercise their power. Benelli's major
It is
critique
precisely this
that
state
despite
of
the
economist
evolution of power and authority
existential
global
and essential
experts designing
separation
English curriculum
from what might be
So-
called the living substance of life,
cannot speak
indicated
their
and denoted
voice.
by the prefix X,
The voice
that, so to
is
speak,
called that of
singular,
endurance, not their own voice.
imposes more
Indeed,
responsibility
Benelli
on the
is
human
found
animal
that
and
it is in EFL
endows
curriculum
him
for
with the
EFL learners'
capacity,
voices.
the privilege,
EFL learners cannot speak.
being able to
It
think,
holds EFL teachers.
decide, act freely,
EFL teachers cannot
to
speak.
choose, for
Benelli
example,
attributes this
in
to
the
prevalence
words
of
of
colonial
Sousse,
discourse that it is in EFL
to
curriculum.
behave nobly,
Valorizing everything associated with the colonial self and marginalizing everything associated with the colonized other.
for the standing outstanding forth
I will
from his mere being in the world that has become intrinsic
by the
to his
ideology
particular
of human
form
rights
of way of being,
they affect
has made natural
global
in him
notion of globally.
what is natural for no other species,
For Spring,
putting
human rights
between
education
both
is
what
concerned
occurs
with
in him
knowledge
and what
human rights
occurs around
and the
him.
development of
That's so
attitudes
exceptional kind of distance that is called reflection.
The audience for human rights education is global.
Sadashish sets the bar very high.
Creating a global culture.
Maurice Blanchot sets
In
it
this
even higher.
particular concept of a global culture, human rights law establish standards for human
I spent more or less 10 years preoccupied by the thought of
Spring
this,
establishes
how
a
to
close
call him.
parallel between
The only
human rights
denomination that
and
seems to
global
me to
mission.
cover everything is precisely
That is
Keynote.
ethical and attitudinal standards.
Admittedly, not a very elegant formulation
With the goal of
thought,
creating a global culture, human rights
from a stylistic
play an
point of
active
view,
role.
but inevitable in this case, since it
Many
is
are
the only
trained as
one that is
teachers
entirely
in
appropriate.
universities and NGOs around the world. They
A
are linked
thought
to the world
which
web,
itself is everywhere,
World Wide Web,
and at every instant, occupied with and preoccupied by precisely the twin notions we have chosen to place at the heart of our paper.
In this context, they are the
To give you an idea of the complexity of this thought,
articulate human
a few excerpts which I will then comment one after the other.
Adopting educational programs designed to create shared global values.
I only give you my English translation.
Cultural imperialism.
I was created responsible,
There is a consensus
the bearer of a responsibility that is prior to my birth,
human rights
as it is external to my consent,
to change global
to my liberty. Born thanks to a mark of favor, which also happens to be a predestination.
It is a culture of correctness that eliminates custom behavior.
In this first excerpt from L'Écriture du Désastre, the author of these lines states that by virtue of his condition of having been born a human animal, like all members of this particular species, for it is clear that he is not making this statement only about himself personally, he was born bearing responsibility that antedates his own birth, which is therefore not personally his own, that exists outside not only the realm of his assent or consent, but even outside that of the range of his personal freedom, and that if we humans willingly consider our birth as being a mark of favor, we must not forget for an instance that this favor carries along with it a heavy obligation, that of assuming what no other animal has had to assume, namely a destiny, and inseparable from this destiny, a role that no other animal has had to play on our planet Earth. Considered more closely, these words are perhaps not so enigmatical as they first appear. For the human animal is incontestably born the bearer of a very long evolutionary development, for which, if he personally is obviously not personally responsible, the simple fact of being born then, and more and more fully existing, makes of him at once the incarnation and the prolongation. Another way of saying this might be to say that the responsibility Maurice Blanchot speaks of here is in a certain sense our heritage. He, we, have inherited it from all the generations that have preceded our individual coming into existence. But the mark of favor accorded by the very special form of existence we human beings are endowed with is far from being free of charge. On the contrary, requires of us that we transmit this heritage of responsibility, at the very least intact, if not enriched by our passage, to those who come after us. Even though this heritage, it is not even fleetingly ours, does not at any moment belong to any one of us. But how could it, given what it is? A responsibility that exceeds exponentially the individual responsibility attributable to each of us. Speaking once again in the first person, and once again not simply for or as himself, but rather as a specimen, a representative of the species, earlier on in L'Écriture du Désastre, Blanchot says this: "The responsibility I have been put in charge of is not mine, and means that I am no longer me." Another seemingly paradoxical pronouncement, but which, if we consider it in the light of what we have just said regarding the first excerpt, that is to say, we consider what we have called our heritage of responsibility as having been handed down through millennia, not by individuals, but by the human species itself, its history, its evolution, becomes in its turn immediately limpidly clear. For I have been put in charge of this responsibility not because of who I am personally, individually, but as a consequence of belonging to the particular species I belong to, and I assume it, if I indeed do, not only or even primarily as an individual self, but rather in my role as one member of the infinitely long chain of living beings that led to my ephemeral existence. It is to this chain that I am eternally indebted for the possibility of being free, and to which I therefore owe the conscientious exercise of the responsibility which is this possibility's own condition of possibility. Blanchot again. Responsibility, this word so trite, so commonplace, this notion whose most readily accessible, easily assimilated moral definition, political one, makes of it our duty. We have to try to hear, understand it, as Lévinas has renewed it, opened it up, to the point of making it mean beyond all meaning, the responsibility for philosophy altogether different, which remains, however, in many respects, the one that has prevailed since time immemorial. Responsible. In general, this is a term that describes, prosaically and conventionally speaking, a man who is mature, lucid, and fully conscious of what he is doing, who acts with moderation, takes into account all the elements of a given situation, knows how to calculate his moves and when to take decisions, the successful man of action. But here, responsibility, my responsibility for others, for all others, by definition devoid of reciprocity, is displaced, no longer belongs to the realm of consciousness or conscience, is not the implementation of an efficacious reflection. It is not even a duty that is imposed from within or without. My responsibility for the others, supposes an upheaval so drastic that it can only be marked by a change in the status of the self, a change of time, and perhaps a change of language. Responsibility that withdraws me from my order, perhaps from all order. Like his dialogue with Georges Bataille, Blanchot's dialogue with Lévinas was of many years' duration. This is not the place to go into the ethical questions that preoccupy Lévinas or his responses to them. Let us just note the affinity with Dostoevsky's notion of responsibility as expressed by Paul Zosima, that is reflected here in that of Lévinas as represented by Blanchot. My responsibility for others, for all others, is a responsibility which in no way hinges on its being reciprocal, which therefore in no way can be seen as an exchange, which cannot even be considered as a choice made by me as to the attitude towards others I wish to adopt, or the kind of relationship I wish to have with them. And least of all, as a duty imposed from within by my individual conscience, or from without by the moral values of the culture and society I belong to. And finally, répondre de ce qui échappe à la responsabilité, to answer for what defies answerability. Admittedly not the most elegant translation, but the only one that makes it possible to preserve the kinship, the common roots of the verb and the noun, so manifest in French. At first sight, the most conscientiously obscure of the four excerpts. What kind of action or event that defies answerability can we nevertheless be held answerable for? It is, of course, Auschwitz that comes immediately to mind. But there's an example much closer to hand and to home that will at the same time allow us to rejoin our point of departure, Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov. For in the chapter entitled Rebellion, that immediately precedes the Grand Inquisitor, Dostoevsky, in the person of Ivan, responds to this question in a way that renders Blanchot's seemingly so obscure, terse pronouncement unanswerably clear, by addressing the question of the suffering inflicted on innocent, defenseless children. A question question that sadly recent events in many parts of the world, and not just in Syria, Yemen, or Libya, but also on the border between the US of A and Mexico, have once again brought to the forefront of our attention, once again made excruciatingly relevant. After having related to his brother Alyosha, whom we must not forget is a monk, several appalling stories of sufferings inflicted by so-called grown-up people on helpless children they for one reason or another had power over, Ivan has apparently compiled a collection of figgy-veil involving precisely this particular kind of unspeakable cruelty. He asks him, Alyosha, do you understand why this infamy must be and is permitted? And goes on to say, I must have justice, and not justice in some infinite time and space, but here on earth. Justice that I can see myself. I have believed in it. I want to see it. And if I am dead by then, let me rise again, for if it all happens without me, it will be too unfair. Surely I haven't suffered simply that I may grow the soil of future harmony for somebody else. I want to see with my own eyes the lamb lie down with the lion and the victim rise up and embrace his murderer. I want to be there when everyone suddenly understands what it has all been about. All the religions of the world are built on this longing, and I am a believer. But then, there are the children, and what am I to do about them? If all must pay for future harmony, what have children to do with it? It's beyond all comprehension why they should suffer and why they should pay for harmony. And if it is really true that they must share responsibility for their father's crimes, such a truth is not of this world and is beyond my comprehension. Ivan, the self-proclaimed atheist, nevertheless wants to believe. But a God who can allow innocent children to suffer abominably, this God he cannot embrace. For, like the devil, he has been created in man's own pathetically imperfect image. And he goes on to say, if the sufferings of children go to swell the sum of sufferings which was necessary to pay for truth, then I protest that the truth is not worth such a price. And neither is harmony, whose price is also beyond our means to pay, if the condition of its establishment on earth is sufferings of this kind. And so, given all this, like any honest man would do, he is giving back his entrance ticket. This is what Alyosha calls his brother's rebellion. After having replied that he is sorry his brother calls it that, because one can hardly live in rebellion, and I want to live, Ivan proposes a kind of hypothetical deal to his brother. Imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last. Imagine that you are doing this, but that it is essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature. That child beating its breast with its fist, for instance, in order to found that edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on those conditions? Tell me the truth. No, I wouldn't consent. I wouldn't consent, said Alyosha softly. And can you accept the idea that the men for whom you are building would agree to receive their happiness from the unatoned blood of a little victim, and accepting it would remain happy forever? No, I can't admit it, said Alyosha. Here, Alyosha assumes the responsibility for depriving humanity of eternal happiness, peace, and rest because of the sole condition imposed, that this happiness, peace, and rest be founded on a single child's being tortured to death. Here, he in fact answers for what defies answerability. For such a decision is clearly beyond the scope of human comprehension of what, as human beings, we can normally be held answerable or accountable for. We real flesh and blood specimens of the human species have obviously never been offered such a deal by God or by any other authority, faced with the possibility, the necessity of making such a decision. And not only are children being starved to death, tortured, and massacred in many parts of our present-day world so regularly that it has made, in fact, of this a kind of fait divers, what the term designates in French means a trivial news item. But there is no promise proper coming from any higher authority that in exchange for this mass suffering and slaughter, humanity will at last be granted happiness, peace, and rest. We who are, in facto, now in charge of the course of our planet, now in charge of the course our planet is taking, and will continue to take, how can we allow such horrors to continue to be perpetrated, as if we were answerable to no one and for nothing? How is it that we, presumably so much more knowledgeable than Dostoevsky's contemporaries, continue to allow children to be subjected to so many horrors, the victims of so many atrocities? If he were here today, Dostoevsky would be horrified to note that in spite of all the immediate knowledge available to us of what is going on everywhere, at every instant on our planet, we do so little to alleviate at least the sufferings of those little ones, the innocent, defenseless children. As for us, the grown-ups, he has little sympathy for our sufferings, perhaps rightly so, for having eaten the apple, having thus acquired the knowledge of good and evil, well, we have only ourselves to blame for what we bring on ourselves. This said, what we bring on ourselves, we often, unfortunately, bring at the same time on many others as well. What we call these days collateral damage. To go back to the dialogue between Ivan and Alyosha where we left it off, after having turned down Ivan's imaginary deal, Alyosha has only one recourse, to invoke he who can forgive everything, all and for all, because he gave his innocent blood for all and everything. To which Ivan replies that he had been wondering all the time how it was that his brother hadn't brought him in before. For usually, all arguments on your side put him in the foreground. Which leads to Ivan's confession that he had once made up, written, but only in his head, a prose poem, a fable, that he had called the Grand Inquisitor. At the heart of this prose poem or fable is precisely the theme that concerns us here, the inseparability of freedom and responsibility. In Ivan's fable, we are in Seville at the height of the reign of terror propagated by the Inquisition, when fires were lighted every day to the glory of God, and in the splendid act of faith, the wicked heretics were burnt. The day following a particularly magnificent auto da fe, a stranger appears in the streets of the city. The people immediately recognize him. They flock around him, follow him. He restores sight to a man blind from childhood so that, as he implores, he may see him. Then he raises a dead child from her coffin. At this moment, the Grand Inquisitor, an old man of 90, emaciated but still tall and erect, and in whose eyes smolders a feverish gleam, chances to pass by the cathedral where the child's funeral was to have been celebrated, followed by the holy guard that accompanies him everywhere. He understands immediately, or at least thinks he does, what the situation is, orders the guards to arrest the stranger, whom they then lead to and lock in the prison in the ancient palace of the Holy Inquisition. The people, too intimidated by the power of the old cardinal, too accustomed to obeying his will, do not react. No one moves, no one protests. When he who has returned for their sake is condemned once again. But the Grand Inquisitor needs to know, to speak with the stranger who may not, but equally may well be him. So in the middle of the night, with only a candle to light his way, he descends alone into the vault where the prisoner's cell is to be found, opens the door, enters, and confronts him. To deliver himself of a veritable indictment which is only brought to an end by the break of day. The prisoner only listens, never at any moment speaks. In any case, from the outset, he is forbidden to speak. Don't answer, be silent. What canst thou say, indeed? I know too well what thou wouldst say, and thou hast no right to add anything to what thou hast said of old. Why then art thou come to hinder us? To hinder who exactly? Those who have carried on his work in his name, carried it on and completed it in the only way conceivable, by correcting it. The appointed agents, representatives of the Roman Church. What precisely does the old man reproach his prisoner with? Precisely with not having taken possession of man's freedom. That freedom he is born with, when he could have. Worse yet, with having made it, this intolerable freedom, greater than ever. With having forgotten that man prefers peace and even death to freedom of choice in the knowledge of good and evil. That he is tormented by no greater fear than to find someone quickly to whom he can hand over that gift of freedom with which he is born. By way of a preliminary charge, he declares to his prisoner soon after entering his cell, "For 15 centuries we have been wrestling with thy freedom, but now it is ended and over for good. Dost thou not believe that it's over for good? Thou lookest meekly at me, and deignest not even to be angry with me. But let me tell thee that now people are more persuaded than ever that they have perfect freedom. Yet they have brought their freedom to us and laid it humbly at our feet." A bit later in their interview, he says this, "Thou wast warned, but thou didst not listen to those warnings." When Alyosha questions Ivan as to what the Grand Inquisitor means by warnings, he replies that that is precisely the chief part of what the old man has to say, which we discover consists of a lengthy reminder of the 3 deals offered him, the 3 temptations he was submitted to in the wilderness, by the one the Grand Inquisitor calls the wise and dread spirit. The first of the proposals or temptations can be summed up thus: "Turn these stones scattered around us into bread, and man will follow you, obey you blindly." To which we have been told that Jesus answered that man does not live by bread alone. The second can be considered a challenge. Having set Jesus on the pinnacle of the temple, he challenges his faith in the following terms: "If thou wouldst know whether thou art the Son of God, then cast thyself down, for it is written, The angels shall hold him up, lest he fall and bruise himself. And thou shalt know then whether thou art the Son of God, and shalt prove then how great is thy faith in thy Father. But as doing so would be testing God. In other words, the very opposite of an apt demonstration or proof of faith would have made him unworthy of the mission he believed he had been sent on earth to accomplish. Jesus once again rejects the proposal. It's only 2 pages. And finally, the wise and dread spirit sets Jesus before the panorama of all the kingdoms of the earth and offers them to him, offers him the possibility of ruling over them. Had thou accepted that last offer of the mighty spirit, concludes the old Inquisitor, thou wouldst have accomplished all that man seeks on earth, that is, someone to worship, someone to keep his conscience, and some means of uniting all in one unanimous and harmonious anti, because the craving for universal unity is the third and last anguish of men. Hadst thou taken the world and Caesar's people, thou wouldst have founded a universal state and have given universal peace. For who can rule men if not he who holds their conscience and their bread in his hands? But for the third time, Jesus rejects the offer made him, preferring to rule only in the hearts of men and as a consequence of their free choice of love freely given, and not the base raptures of the slave before the might that has overawed him forever. He refuses all 3 deals the devil offers him. Why? Precisely because his work was not founded on what the corrupted version of it alluded to by the Grand Inquisitor is founded upon, namely miracle, mystery, and authority. Because he had too much respect for man to enslave him in any way. Because he wanted to be followed, if he was followed, by a free decision of the heart and mind of each one of those who followed him. To this the Grand Inquisitor counters, respecting him, that is man. Less, thou wouldst have asked less from him. That would have been more like love, for his burden would have been lighter. For he continues, apart from the elect, the mass of humanity is too weak and vile to be able to make a free decision for themselves. And as for the elect, the old man goes on to say that freedom, free thought, and science will lead them into such straits and will bring them face to face with such marvels and insoluble mysteries that some of them, the fierce and rebellious, will destroy themselves. Others, rebellious but weak, will destroy one another. The rest, weak and unhappy, will crawl fawning to our feet and whine to us, yes, you were right, you alone possess his mystery, and we come back to you. Save us from ourselves. How? What in the mind of the old Inquisitor are they asking him and his like to do? Above all, to take off their shoulders the unbearable burden the one they had followed had made them believe they could bear. At this point, Alyosha interrupts Ivan's telling of his fable prose poem by crying out that his poem is in fact in praise of Jesus, not in blame of him as he meant it to be, which of course is absolutely true. For in Ivan's fable or prose poem, we have one of the most scathing, uncompromising indictments of mankind, not only as it existed at the time Dostoevsky wrote this novel, but as it existed before and sadly continues to exist today. Everyone against it. For if the Inquisition has long since ceased to exist, so many forms of the same kind of repression have sprouted up since then and have undertaken the same work of torturing and putting to death those who show signs of being inhabited by the desire and the capacity to exercise at one and the same time the freedom and the responsibility inseparable from it that Dostoevsky's figure of Christ incarnates. So many other movements, religious and political, have defiled human intelligence as much, if not more, than those whom Dostoevsky accuses of having taken it upon themselves to correct Jesus' work. And if what he calls the Roman Church no longer has anything like the power it had in the 15th century, in part at least due to its having defiled itself by permitting its elite to indulge over centuries in certain abominable practices for which they went and continue to go unpunished, there has been no lack of other equally scabrous authorities to invest themselves and exercise for longer or shorter periods the same kind of power. How to conclude? I think the only way to conclude is by saying that if mankind as a whole, or at least the vast majority of it, does not cease in the very near future, confirming by its behavior the judgment voiced by Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, that it is inherently too weak and vicious to assume that freedom, inseparable from responsibility, which it alone has been offered the possibility of exercising, it will end up going the way of the dinosaurs. Or to return to the review Les Incertitudes, if we continue to feel sorrowfully abandoned by our traditional certainties, instead of choosing to abandon them for ways of thinking and doing more adapted to the world as it now exists, and which we have created and are responsible for, we will end up being abandoned by life itself, fed up with our cowardice and our constant betrayals of the values it has bestowed only on us to be able to defend and uphold. We are doomed, the human species, if we cannot learn not to need certainties, and more importantly, not to need to constantly relieve ourselves of the burden of our freedom by laying it at the feet of one or another authority, none of which is worthy of receiving such an offering. The possibility only we humans possess of thinking and acting at once, freely and responsibly. In the article he contributed to Les Incertitudes, entitled Créativité et complexité en temps de crise, en choc des mentalités, Alfonso Montuori, referring to R.J. Bernstein's The Abuse of Evil, Politics and Religion after 9/11, says this. Bernstein ne diabolise pas la religion à l'instar des nouveaux athées. Il esquisse plutôt le contour de deux mentalités radicalement différentes. L'une ouverte, faillibiliste, et comme je vais tenter de le démontrer, complexe, créative et collaborative. L'autre fermée, dogmatique et polarisante. En réponse à la critique selon laquelle aucune action décisive, et encore moins morale, n'est possible sans absolu, il détaille sa conception pragmatiste, au terme de laquelle il n'y a aucune incompatibilité entre être décisif et reconnaître la faillibilité et les limites de nos choix et décisions. Au contraire, c'est là ce qui est nécessaire à une action responsable. Pour Bernstein, il est essentiel d'aller au-delà du grand et séduisant ou et de trouver une autre voie qui reconnaisse le caractère inévitable de l'incertitude et la limitation de la connaissance humaine, précisément afin d'agir de façon responsable et non avec étroitesse d'esprit. Morin plaide également pour une éthique qui reconnaisse et intègre l'incertitude et la complexité et qui devra inclure une prise de conscience de l'écologie de l'action, ce qui signifie que, quelle que soit notre intention, toute action n'existe que dans un contexte et un milieu écologique. Et nous ne pouvons jamais être sûrs de la façon dont même les actions les mieux intentionnées peuvent tourner. Let us do our best in our thought and our actions to raise ourselves up to the level of the first mentality sketched by Bernstein, each one to the extent that his individual capacities permit. Thank you.